Audio.
The goal is strength training. Strength training is increasing max effort. Force is the thing we need to worry about. So you just need to work hard. It has to be heavy. It has to feel heavy.
Hey y'all, I'm Ryan Devlin, and welcome to this Struggle Climbing Show Pro Clinic with coaches Collin McGee and Jesse Firestone of Camp 4 Human Performance, focused on off-season finger strength training and just overall strength training from toes to nose. How you doing today? I hope you're doing awesome. I'm doing awesome because we are about to geek out over training, and I love me some training nerdery. Now, this is an area of particular expertise and interest for Collin and Jesse, and they deliver the goods today, you guys, as we explore what our quote-unquote off-season even is, depending on what type of climber we are and what our overall lifestyle is, what adaptations we should be seeking in a strength training program, why strength training doesn't and perhaps even shouldn't look like climbing. And then, and here's the gold, we get into very clear and specific protocols and programming ideas for how to get stronger fingers in about 20 minutes a week. Thank you very much. Which big muscle exercises to group together for optimal efficiency and gains. We get into set and rep recommendations, and we even then get into very specifically programs like, hey, here's day A and day B, here's what you should be doing after your warm-up. So if you want to be handed a very clear idea of what you could be doing in your off-season and how to build strength from your fingers to your nose to your toes and everything in between, this is the Pro Clinic for you. Now, you probably recognize today's guests as they're both quite prolific in the climbing/coaching world. Coach Jay Fire was, of course, a recent guest on our show, offering up a pro clinic of his own on the best ways to start off the year. I loved that interview. You should revisit it if you haven't heard it. He's been climbing for 17 years, and he's coached climbers around the world, from those who have only been climbing for a few months to those sending V13 and participating in World Cups. Now, Coach Collin McGee is a highly certified and experienced strength and conditioning coach who works with people from all walks of life, and he has a specialization in S&C for climbers. He's a fellow weekend warrior who believes in providing fun, positive training experiences based on education to better people's lives and sports performance. And he's also just an incredible content creator. If you're not following him on Instagram, you got to check out the stuff he puts out. It's really funny, it's really informative, and it's super helpful. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. Now, both Collin and Jesse are part of the Camp 4 Human Performance coaching team, working closely with Dr. Tyler Nelson, who, of course, has been a frequent guest on the show here. And in this conversation, research meets real life as we set out to leave you, yes, you, with a very clear idea of how to bring strength training into your weekly routine in a way that will not only improve your climbing performance, awesome, but will also help you to be more resilient to injury and just feel better in every aspect of your life. Let's go. And guys, I just want to take a second here to shout out all of you patrons and Apple subscribers out there, not just of my show, but of everybody who's working hard to put out content for the climbing world and beyond. So I'm a patron of a lot of shows. I'm a patron of Power Company Climbing, of A Normal Cast, and The Run Out, of Camp 4 Human Performance, today's guests, The Nugget, Aiden and Sam's Careless Talk podcast. There's like loads of Patreons that I'm a member of, and I love it. I get such good bonus content being a part of those communities, but also beyond that, I just feel really good every month to support people who are working really hard to put out quality content to make me a better climber and just bring joy to my life. So I am a creator myself, but I also support a lot of creators. And if you have the means to support what I'm doing here at The Struggle, I would love your support over at patreon.com/The Struggle Climbing Show. And again, if you can support the Camp 4 guys and anybody else that you are enjoying as a climber, that would be awesome. Thank you. I love you. And one more thing here, listen to the very end where I'm going to tell you how you can win a custom self-guided 12-week plan plus a consultation with Coach Collin McGee. He's graciously giving away one of these plans to one of our listeners here, and I'll also share a code on how you can get a huge discount off of that plan as well if you don't win the giveaway. All right, let's dial in some strength with Collin McGee and Jesse Firestone. I think probably the place to start will be to try to define what off-season strength training really means, and then we can get into some ideas and some applications and methodologies and maybe even a little bit of talk around programming and this kind of thing. But there's kind of two terms that I'm sandwiching together here that we should pick apart. One is off-season and one is strength training. And I bring up off-season selfishly because I'm in the off-season right now. As we're recording this, it's June, and I'm in Kentucky. And so I would consider this, for me, off-season because it's quite hot and humid now. My Sen seasons are kind of the spring and the fall. But that's not always the case for everybody. And oftentimes, summer is the season. That's when people are able to travel and get out to rifle or get to some of these places where, due to their work schedule or school or whatever, like this is Sen season. So while this is off season for me, and I don't even know what that means because I'm going out to the Red tomorrow, it's maybe worth having a few minutes of conversation through your lens here, what off season is. And Jesse, maybe I'll start with you because you just noted that in your estimation, most of what we do is kind of quote unquote off season. So how do you think about off season? How can we try to define that for the purposes of this conversation?
So I think the one big thing with like contemplating having an off season and an on season is just gaining control of the sort of natural curve of athletic performance that you're going to have. Like, I think we have this tendency to see people on Instagram sending like, 15B or 15C or whatever. And we just see that every few months. And so we assume that their performance is like this, constant line of like, I send 15B every 2 months or whatever. But actually that's like representative of this kind of sine wave that you get where they're having peak moments where they're sending really hard, and they're probably having low moments where they're more tired at the crag and they're trying really hard, but they're like not getting as much out of it. Right. And so the goal of like having an on season and an off season is to kind of gain control of that curve. And hopefully you don't have to have periodized training, which we can talk about what that means too, but you don't have to periodize things in order to have control of that curve. It's more like, what are we focusing on getting out of our climbing and our athletic development right now? Probably during the on season or the in season, the goal is to perform in climbing and to have those experiences that we're going to remember for the rest of our life, right? That's what we want. That's probably what most people are focused on most of the time, I would say. And then the off season is more like, if you know that you're naturally going to have this kind of decline where you're getting tired, you're not climbing as well and stuff, and that's usually going to coincide with conditions if you mostly climb outside, you might as well automatically kind of consider that your off season and work on some other aspects of your athleticism, right? That's kind of like the general idea of seasonality. And then there's a whole bunch of concordant things that come with that, like changing your velocity and the intensity of your training, or like the variability of your training, yada, yada, yada. And maybe I'll let Collin bounce in and define strength training, unless you have something else to add, Ryan.
Well, yeah, just one follow-up question on that, and then we'll get into the definition of strength training. And that's for those who maybe either climb predominantly inside at a gym, or they travel and they follow the conditions, and in essence there isn't an environmental kind of demarcation on season and off season like I'm talking about here in Kentucky. Are you saying then it's still this sine wave where you're going to have periods of higher energy and lower energy, and so do you have to essentially force an off season, or is it still apparent when those periods are upon us because we start to just feel it?
It's going to happen one way or another. So how on your on season is and how off your off season is really going to depend by the athlete, right? So if somebody climbs in a gym 12 months a year, they're mostly focused on gym bouldering, that's the experience they want. Their in season and off season might not be a huge shift. It might just be like going from doing a couple maintenance strength training exercises to doing a full day of strength training for their off season, and kind of like, that's it. You know what I mean? It's like their volume of training changes very slightly. Their climbing output changes very slightly. For somebody who is more focused on climbing outside, it's probably going to be more dramatic. And then for somebody who's like maybe living in a city and they just have a few weeks a year to go climb outside, but that's what they're focused on, that's where you get that really dramatic shift of like most of their year is actually the off season, and then they have like a few weeks where they're in season, right? So it is like a very individualized sort of personal thing. And I mean, it's funny to me to be doing this call right now because, like you said, summer's kind of a traditional off season for most people, but I'm leaving for a 2-month climbing trip in like, 10 days or something. And my spring climbing season like hasn't ended yet. So not a lot of time for an off season in the interim, right? And that's just like kind of a natural side effect of being like an outdoor focused climber is I will have to spend I already spent some of my spring season training, and I will have to spend some of this summer trip that I'm going on in the gym in order to maintain that longer performance season, right? It's kind of like a natural consequence.
Yeah, that's super important. And I think as we get into maybe talking about some programming, we can tease that apart a little bit more, because I think for me, I've got a little bit of confusion around that, and I think those who are listening probably would like some general ideas on the periodization like you're talking about in some of those phases. But let's talk about strength training, and as we're sandwiching those terms together, off-season strength training. Collin, how do you consider strength training?
Yeah, I think the main issue I see working with climbers, and whether it's the enthusiast that's outside all the time or in the gym, is the definition of strength gets whispered down the alley and it kind of gets just confused. Where if we would go and talk to maybe an exercise physiologist or whatever that goes through some more academia, strength training seems pretty straightforward. And I think the first thing is to bring some objectivity to strength training. I brought out my book from a library here in the gym. For any viewers, it's called Super Training. It's in the thing. But this is like one of the classic books that is so dense. I haven't read this. It's the words and syllables are too big for even me.
And if you don't happen to have a kettlebell nearby, it looks like you could just use that as your weight.
100%. This thing is thick with a lot of C's, like thousands of pages. Anyway, the book author, Yuri Verkhoshansky, is one of the godfathers of strength training. And very simply, like in the first, like page 1, it talks about strength training classically being defined as the ability of a given muscle or group of muscles to produce force under a specific context. And so strength training is all about producing effort. So for those that don't really understand muscular force, it's just effort. Like, how hard can you work? When you shake my hand, can you squeeze it really hard and do I go ow? Or is it like really soft? Like, that's just effort. And when it comes to strength training, no matter if it's fingers or hamstrings for heel hooking or a squat, push, or pull for just general strength, we're trying to increase our body's ability to give effort. And there are just certain ways to go about that. I think then once we have that, because I'll talk to, I think the classic thing is, to get stronger at climbing, you just climb more. Or I was talking to a friend dad the other day about mountain biking. He's like, I'm working on strengthening my knee by going out and riding more. But if we go back to a classical definition of strength training, that it's, I need to produce more force, therefore we probably have to be working at a higher percentage of this maximum. To do that, we look at mountain biking and climbing and all that, and it's really sub-maximal, done for hundreds, if not thousands of reps if you're running or cycling. And then if we kind of think backwards, like, well, it can't really be strength training. You're getting better, and maybe a little bit of strength is aiding into those things. But I think it's all of that kind of conversation that kind of makes things confusing. So hopefully at the end of the day, we just know that strength training is increasing our ability to give near maximum effort and increasing our maximum. And then, we'll dive into the nuance of the continuum of strength at speed, strength endurance, right? All these types of things. But we have to be working hard. It has to be pretty heavy or high effort to be considered strength training in that realm. And then the second biggest point I think about strength training to understand is that there's a big thing out there that strength training is bad for climbing, makes you a bad climber. And in my head, I see this movie scenario where someone who, let's say they have a goal of climbing V10 outside and they're a hardcore outdoor climber, they walk into the gym and they see maybe Jim Bro. Jim Bro has big muscles, and then they just saw them leave the bench press. They go over and they're flopping around on the V3. And they must go, see, big muscle, bad for climbing. But you don't know that climbing is their goal. Like, have you talked to the person and said, are you trying to actually improve? Or are you just inside and you love fitness and you love getting stronger? And the new climbing gym just opened up on the block and that thing looks sweet. I've never been into a fitness gym with big plastic walls to climb on, because Jesse and I were talking about this a little bit last night, where for me and my people, I've never, ever heard a climber go, I got stronger and I got worse at climbing.
Right.
Never. No sport in the world has ever said that. And even to the misconceptions where you touch a dumbbell and then poof, you look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And like, no. Like, realistically, that's not going to kind of happen. And then affect your climbing. There's plenty of big bodybuilding like physiques that are super flexible and super athletic and mobile. So it's never the thing that makes you bad, it's the lack of. So going back to the gym bro person, it's not the fact that they're strong and muscular and made them bad at this hypothetical V3, maybe just not the time spent climbing. And I don't think any one of us or any coaches and our colleagues in our circles who really push strength training, we don't say strength train only, don't climb. Like I've never once told someone, hey, hire me and don't even look at Jesse. Like he's not going to help you. Like I was like, you have to be with Jesse alongside strength training. Otherwise it's not going to make sense if your goal is to get better at climbing. And me, the avatar, I've come from a strength training background, so this was kind of easy. Therefore I knew what to do. But then when I worked with Jesse, this climbing skills, rock philosopher, but all this stuff, that's where my climbing really took off. And it's that aha moment with every other sport as well, is you want to become more physically capable, which is what strength training does. You want to become more resilient to the oh shit moments that sports give you when you get hurt. And then you take those two main benefits and then you learn how to apply them to the skill of the sport and you get better. You just rinse, wash, and repeat. You ping pong those things back and forth until the day our time here is no longer. And that's how you see your true potential when it comes to climbing. But again, to zoom out, no one is saying that strength train only, forget about learning how to climb better, right? Where I think it kind of gets mixed up and like, oh, it can't be good for climbing. It doesn't look like climbing. All people who are strong are bad climbers. Like, no. Right? It's understand what strength training does for us. Physical capability to do more things, physical tolerance to handle more load, and then we can climb more and we can learn how to get better. And then, your genetics and your confidence and your psychology, all that is going to help you see your ceiling. But both of those things kind of need to balance themselves out, so to speak, depending on your goals at the end of the day.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that, for those who follow you guys, Tyler, some of the other, fantastic coaches and trainers that are on there, Natasha puts some really good content out as well. I think what is clear is that there are a lot of different ways to build strength. And we certainly can and do build strength on the wall. We can climb slowly on small holds and, build some finger strength that way. And we can practice heel hooks like Jesse, you put out recently, climbing like kind of the arete of your board where you're like heel hooking everything. And that's going to be building some strength and that kind of thing. But maybe, and tell me if I'm oversimplifying, but for purposes of this conversation, maybe we turn our sights to off the wall strength training as we're talking about off season. And yes, we're still going to be climbing. Most people are still going to get some gym days in or some crag days in like I am. It's going to be 85 degrees and probably 90% humidity, but I'm still going out because it's fun to be in nature and it's fun to move over a rock. And I'm not going to be trying to climb my 13A project. I'll, just be sweating up, some 510s or something like that. But it brings me joy and happiness. So there is still going to be that movement in there. But maybe for purposes of this conversation, as we're talking about off-season strength training, most of, if not all of our focus will be on building strength off the wall. So I don't know, weightlifting or calisthenics or heavy hangs or isometric pulls and these kinds of things, which we can get into. Is that a fair place to start?
So I think the issue that Collin brought up of people sort of assuming that strength might be bad or that strength training might be bad comes from a lack of specificity of language. Like we have this tendency as climbers to be like, oh yeah, that person's a really strong climber, but we don't actually like talk about what that means. So some people might say like, Sean Bailey is a really strong climber. And like, that's absolutely true. He is a really strong person in all the ways that matter for being a rock climber. I don't know how much he can like, bench or squat, but I would, I think I'd go out on a limb and say that it's probably nothing like world class, right? But he is a world class rock climber in terms of his force development where it counts. So even when you start to talk about things like doing the wall crawls and trying to get your fingers to feel better on small holds, the specificity of language thing would make me say that is developing coordination of the fingers and not necessarily like pure force development, right? And this gets into one of the most important things in strength training, which is the SAID principle. And I'm not sure if you've covered that on the podcast before, but the things that we train create adaptations, and we need to kind of work backwards. We need to pick the adaptations that we want to get out of our training and train something that's going to give them. So the SAID principle is specific adaptation to impose demand. It basically means you get better at whatever you tell yourself to do. So I'm with you on the idea of this podcast being about off the wall strength training, but as far as like the positional strength thing I posted not long ago where I'm doing the heel hooks up the board and I'm holding those isometric positions, that is very literally strength training. Like in terms of the force velocity spectrum or continuum, like that is on the strength end of things. And that is actually a type of climbing that I think would be like pretty productive for people to do in their off season. That's pretty nuanced. And I don't think like every climber needs to worry about doing that. But there are definitely like some tweaks that we could make to the actual content of the climbing during an off season to like hopefully get the adaptations that we want from our off season block. That said, most of these things are going to be off the wall. So I think you're dead on that, like worrying about the weight room and finger training and stuff like that probably makes more sense. I just think it's important to kind of step back and think about the adaptations point of view, because I think that's something that gets lost in this conversation because people are like, oh, I want to get, stronger. Like that's something I hear all the time in consults. Like I just need stronger fingers, and then you look at the numbers that this person can do on a max hang or on a pickup. And it's like, well, I don't know what your definition of strength is, but you're not lacking for, the ability to put force through your fingers. So it's either the speed that you can produce that force, or it's the coordination of being able to do it on a small enough hold, or your technique sucks and you need to learn how to get your body underneath the hold so that you can exert force on it. Being more specific with that language really helps us make sure that we train the right thing. Otherwise, we're going to have a 2-month off season where we do a bunch of crap and we go right into the next season with all the same deficits that we had before.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the nuance there. And we certainly don't need to exclude on the wall training, right? So like the purpose of this podcast isn't off the wall training, it's off season strength training. So if you feel one of the best protocols to talk about is something to do on wall, awesome. But maybe just naturally, a lot of this conversation will turn to things that we can do off the wall, which for somebody like me with a couple jobs and a couple kids, I'm constantly looking for the things that I can do that are most bang for the buck. So in terms of these adaptations that we're going to be looking for kind of off season to develop, what do you think they are?
I think if I had to generalize when it comes to the climbing, getting heavy on the weights is probably one of the best things, because if you look at rock climbing, if you're kind of doing it with good efficiency and technique, your feet are on. And so everything's going to be pretty sub body weight and sub maximal. Now, the isometric version of things, so a heel hook that you're squeezing into a hold or you're gripping into a hold, that allows you to actually work towards 100% effort. So if you're doing the wall crawls and kind of the heel hook stuff that we mentioned from Jesse's videos, and you really squeeze into the arete and you really squeeze into those holds, almost like over grip it intentionally, you're definitely going to have an opportunity to get a strength training stimulus out of those things. But for the majority of our muscle groups and joints and positions, it's just not gonna get the job done. It's also not organized because it's chaotic in the reps and the sets and where the force is coming from, what we're using, the speed. And so that's why when you go off the wall and you go into like a weight room, there's numbers on the dumbbells. So you know exactly where kind of to start and then where kind of to go. We have these overarching principles that guide us in the realm. So I think one of the biggest, lowest hanging fruits for the climber avatar to pluck in this off season is when we are spending a little less time on the wall. It's that which we don't get on the wall, which is this heavy movement under organization, under progression, and progressive overload is one of those principles that I think is really easy to incorporate into a lifestyle that you have a lot of time, or a lifestyle that you are crazy and like I have 2 clients and then I got to go do 2 exercises and then I got to coach 3 athletes and they're like, oh, time to go get a squat in. But at the end of the day, my body didn't really care about how I organized it. It just needed to be, checking those boxes of these strength training principles, and then it's going to get it done. So to back up there, finding the movements and the intensities and these loads for nose to toes that I don't get on the climbing wall is what I'm going to seek more of in an off-season strength training program. And so that's where maybe I do leg-based things and push-based things and pull-based things with weights on a machine or dumbbells, because I can control, I can get things heavy, and that is going to start to deposit more of this physical capability and physical tolerance in that big bank that we can kind of make the analogy to. that we can slowly build over this off season, whatever that is the definition for you. And then once we get closer to that climbing season, we can start to make the withdrawals. And now we can start to apply all of that, which we were slowly kind of building up.
Got it. And in this part of the strength training phase, if you will, and we'll talk about ongoing as well, because I don't think we just, let the weights collect dust as we're getting into a performance phase. But right now, recording this in June, I'm going to be looking to perform in October or November. I got some time. So is it true and safe to say that, at least now where I'm at, or at the start of any truly off-the-wall strength phase season, that one doesn't need to worry about making exercises feel like or look like or be specific to what climbing itself is?
Yeah, you don't really need to do that in October either, I don't think. Like the goal, like Collin was saying, the goal of, if you're going to use the word strength, like the goal of strength training is to be able to produce more force. So like more compound, heavier, like more, simple in terms of how much stuff you have to do while you're actually moving the weight is just generally better for strength training. The more like specific and nuanced it gets, probably like the less it's actually like helping you in terms of strength training. Now there's specificity, and that's kind of like a different thing. So if somebody really has like a shoulder project and they really want to get stronger in a certain like range with their shoulder and like abduction and internal rotation, or like when it's way out to the side or something like that, yeah, you can get a little bit more nuanced with some of the selections, but that's probably not something you need to do while they're climbing on their project in October, right? And in terms of increasing your overall force production, you still want to work in the basic ranges in a heavier way for probably most of the off season, and then have like a small dose of that more nuanced training. So like the thing that was going through my head while Collin was talking about like kind of general off season concepts a second ago is like, for me, when I'm writing plans for athletes, for an in-season plan, I feel like I really need to pick the things, or like, what is the most important pieces of athleticism I need to help this person maintain during their season that they're not going to get from climbing? And that is going to be a short list, because a necessary consequence of them being in season is I can't let them get super tired in the weight room, right? They need to stay frosty for the weekends or whatever so they can go climbing and get tired from their climbing, right? But in the off season, it kind of flips a little bit, right? If we have like an assumption that it's someone who has like a pretty defined in season and off season, right? So that's kind of our general assumption. Then we can say, in the in season, I'm going to be very particular. I'm going to pick a handful of things that I think the biggest bang for the buck. I'm not going to get them tired. It's going to be hard, and they're going to get out of there really fast, right? In the off season, we can get a little more tired. We can have a little more variability. They can maybe do a little bit of like FAFO training, like fuck around and find out training, and kind of just like explore things that they're interested in their athleticism, right? And they might get a little bit more tired, do like a little bit more volume, because if they show up to their climbing session a little bit more tired during that off season, it's not as big of a penalty, right? As long as we have some time kind of at the end of the off season or going into their in season where they can kind of like refine their skills and sort of like, like bring the lines into better focus in terms of how they actually climb on the wall and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I think about it. It's more like how much bandwidth do I have as a coach to make athletic development? And in the off season, we just generally have a lot more runway, a lot more bandwidth to make changes.
Yep. And I think a big thing to double up on what Jess said is like, when the goal shifts, keep the goal the goal. And that's a classic Dan John quote that you'll hear from every other strength coach ever. And so one of the comments because of that is, oh man, I'm not sending as hard or as often on the moon board now that we're in off season. Like, that's okay, because we've agreed upon in our consultation or our meeting that, our goal right now is to get stronger and to like dial it back. So your expectations have to change along with that, and you have to be accepting of those things. So I have to accept the fact that I'm going to go on there and some V1s are going to feel absolutely terrible, but my bench press is going to go up and my shoulders are going to get stronger. My legs are going to get stronger. I'm going to be more ready to then switch goals a little bit. So now I maybe, again, don't eliminate lifting, but now my expectation is I'm not going to lift as much, but my expectations are going to be a lot higher because that's where I'm allocating my resources now. So it's kind of like taking your chips and you're just kind of like shuffling them around, and you always have a little bit on everything, but where the majority of the chips are should be where your attention is focused. And you shouldn't be too worried about your climbing performance going down in a situation where it's not necessarily the goal. So that's okay.
Got it. And that is exactly the phase that kind of we're going to be exploring and teasing apart here. And I'm excited to get specific on some muscle systems and various exercises. Before we do, though, I want to make sure that I'm still understanding what this that we're focusing on here actually encapsulates, because we're talking about strength training, but there's also power, right, when it comes to climbing, and then there's endurance when it comes to climbing, and maybe there's a nebulous gray area that kind of goes between all those. Maybe they're not super easy to define, but at least my understanding from listening to you guys, there can be a focus, more of a focus to those chips that you're talking about, Collin. Like, oh, I'm going to put my chips in strength right now. Oh, okay, now my season's starting to approach. Maybe I'll shift some of my chips over to power a little bit more. Maybe I'll shift them to endurance. And at least that's typically the progression that I understand is like strength, power, endurance, peak, or maybe endurance, power endurance, and then a rest period, and then dial up power. And so there's probably quite a bit of nuance that comes into this programming that I'm just glancing over. But if our focus here is on this strength training block, should we solely focus on that, or do things like power and endurance actually come into play in part of this conversation, do you feel?
I think the Venn diagram answer would be to start with strength and assume that's probably the thing that you didn't get the most of during your in-season, because when you are climbing, if you're the boulderer, you've been powering pretty well. And if you're the sport climber, like you at the Red, you've been endurancing pretty well. Like you're probably pretty good on endurance. So again, it's one of those things like, what have you not been doing the most of? It's probably a good time to start there, because that's the bucket that probably got the closest to empty while you were climbing. Now, we can nuance this and split hairs, and I say an assessment is going to let me know exactly where to go. So if we have the opportunity to in-person assess you and see how strong you are and see how fast you move, if you have a force board or a tin deck at home and you can do some remote assessments, you can kind of see if you've been doing baselines where maybe strength has dipped, or where your contact strength in that RFD assessment has dipped, and you can get a little bit more objective direction of where to go with your off-season training. So via assessments and good coaching conversation is how you know exactly what path to take. But to zoom out and give that 30,000 view answer, most likely in your in-season climbing, you were not heavy, slow, intense, progressive, controlled while you were climbing. You were like, oh God, pumped, fall, that kind of stuff. And now it's time to get back some of that strength. So I think for anyone starting at strength for your first phase or cycle or 4 to 6 weeks, probably not a bad idea for the majority of people that are hearing this.
Got it.
The other thing that really plays into that, you're kind of discussing like classic periodization, like which the Anderson brothers really brought to the forefront in the Rock Climbers Training Manual. And I don't know, like anybody who was climbing in like 2005 to 2010 or 2015 even maybe, probably saw them when they were the Rock Prodigy article that had the original periodization kind of manual laid out for rock climbing, how to like stack all these adaptations so that you would have this like perfect moment of glory that lasted for like 2 weeks. But the truth is those guys were working all the time and they only had those 2 weeks. And so that linear periodization is actually like a really risky strategy for performance, right? Because if you stack up all those adaptations and you have your 2 weeks and you don't send and you drag it on and on and on and on, those things that you trained 4 months ago are going to be starting to kind of like fall off not very long after there. We have what we call the durability of adaptations. So remember I was saying like adaptation is the thing we want to think about first, like what is it that we actually want to get, right? And so strength is one of the things we've been talking about the most. The durability of the strength adaptation is very high. Heavy strength training lasts like 10 to 12 weeks before you detrain, assuming that you're being relatively sedentary, right? You're definitely going to lose other adaptations long before you lose your max strength. And if you're continuing to boulder or sport climb, you will hang on to some of that max strength. It's going to start to fall off in terms of like how much you can deadlift, how much you can bench and stuff like that. But it's not going to fall off nearly to the degree that power and endurance are if you move away from those things for a shorter amount of time, right? So if I'm a boulderer, like I just had an injury maybe 2 months ago, and like coming back, my strength was very high, right? But I needed a few sessions before my power and endurance kind of kicked back in. Because those things have a shorter durability of adaptations, right? So they come on really quick. You only need a few sessions to get your power back, to get your endurance back, but they also fade pretty quick. So if you want to train strength and then power and then endurance, that's fine. Just expect that your performance window is going to be very short, which is, obviously most people's next question is, well, then what do I do instead, right? When it's like, yeah, it's more complicated, but you kind of train everything all the time. During the off season, there's still going to be a bigger focus on strength, right? And then you're going to maybe mix in a little bit of power as the season gets closer, right? And once you're in the season properly, most sport climbers can develop the endurance they need, mostly climbing on the wall, maybe doing a little bit of selective like endurance training in the gym or something like that. But as far as like off the wall stuff, the only reason I would recommend people do like endurance finger training, for instance, would be if they can't go outside regularly and climb on their projects, or they can't get to the gym during the week, for instance, like those kind of requirements. I'm a minimalist, probably much more so than Collin and Tyler are. Like most of my clients, it's like we strength train, we climb outside, we climb in a performance mode as much as we possibly can. We get the adaptations we need as long as we need them, and that lets us lengthen that season and do more climbing, right? And at the end of the day, the number of times you go outside probably has a bigger impact on your ability to send than any of the numbers that you could assess, right? That's sort of my mindset with it. For the type of person who can just, they get a month in Kalymnos or they get 2 weeks in rifle or whatever it is, yes, linear periodization absolutely makes sense, and I'll do that with clients too. But most of the time, it's probably too much of a risk to actually make sense.
I think that is applicable to probably a lot of people who are listening right now who aren't trying to peak for a very specific and narrow window. We all want to perform well on the trips that we go on, but I think many people climb more often than just a couple weeks every 4 months or something like that. So let's stay there. We can dip into that climber, that kind of theoretical climber, as we're talking through some of these concepts as well, just if some of the protocols or things that we're talking about here might differ wildly for that person who is very linearly periodized. But for those of us like me and you guys and many of the people who are listening that, want to have a long season and be able to perform and have fun and stay healthy, let's maybe stay in that lane for the most part. And let's talk about strength now. We can maybe dabble into how we would start to work in some power or endurance as that off season, quote unquote, is nearing its completion and we're getting better conditions or a trip is coming up. But Collin, you're talking about some pretty simple stuff here. I know you guys like it simple. I like it complicated. I like it really complicated. I want it so complicated that I need 20 spreadsheets. That's just it. There's comfort. There's comfort in complication for
spreadsheets.
A podcaster like me. I know you guys hate it. I'm just kidding. I like it super, super simple as well myself. I mean, I know it's climbers in general love to like geek out over like the newest, latest thing and all that. But let's definitely start with simple, which I know you guys enjoy as well, because the best workout is the one that you'll do, assuming that it's going to be effective. And let's talk about the heavy things we should be picking up and putting down and how we maybe look at what we want to strengthen just in general, right? Because you said kind of toes to nose. And is it true? Are we looking at like, let's just get strong everywhere? Or are we saying, let's get super strong in our fingers and our shoulders first, and then everything else, maybe if we can fit it in?
Well, every climber's a human. So like there are just benefits to strength training in general, like separately from whether or not you want to increase your climbing performance. But I'm guessing
might
people
be part cyborg. If we're like, I'm not sure everyone's a human, but most of the people listening to this right now are probably humans. And that's actually a good point. I think, Jesse, is that like, we're not just talking, well, let's be honest, we are just talking about sending the next grade here, but fine. Let's step back for a second and say, oh, how about, we can be super active into our 80s and 90s. And that's probably a really good thing to aim for as well. So point well made.
The conversation is going to be heard very differently by people listening to this who are 20, people listening to this who are 30, people listening to this who are 50, because the value of strength training doesn't really change for those people. And in fact, the 20-year-olds can put in a quarter of the effort and get 3 times as much out of it as the 50-year-olds. So the value proposition is still great. The difference is that the 50-year-olds will have felt it personally in their life. They will know how valuable it is, whereas the 20-year-olds probably haven't caught on to that yet. But every climber's a human. Every climber's a human, and every human's going to benefit from strength training. So go ahead, Collin.
So we want to strengthen everything then, Collin, to that point. Because we're humans, we want to make everything strong.
Hell yeah. One of my favorite feedback comments from everyone that I work with who have goals of climbing harder on the moon board to I want to send a couple of my V10 projects are like, oh, wow, I feel better. Oh, wow, playing with my kids didn't hurt my back this year. I took the pool cover off for the first time and I didn't throw my knee out. These little things are like, oh, and you got your fingers strong and you're climbing better? Boom, right? Like, it's that big picture thing that once people realize. And I think it's important because that creates this sustainability of strength training in your lives as a lifestyle, where if we come at it from a like a climbing performance standpoint, I think people think it's a means to an end, which is the climbing in season and the performance and the grade, where I don't think strength training should ever have a means to an end. I think it's just a lifestyle. It's, you're a human, you're a Homo sapien. There's one thing that we know from being coaches and being exercise specialists and being doctors in the medical community is, like sleeping well, low stress, and extra force in the body to get you stronger is the best thing for a human body ever. Like, it just outdoes anything, maybe besides toothpaste, which has killed off a lot of cavemen with the teeth thing. But other than that, like, getting strong is really good. So the zoom out picture, nose to toes, we're getting super strong. But I'll give a little bit of structure like I do with our coaches in our certification course that we do, is like thinking about the movement patterns that we want to check the boxes of. And we talk about knee stuff, we talk about hip dominant stuff, pushing, pulling, both vertically and horizontally. That is probably going to cover the majority of your multi-group big movement things. So what that could look like is I can do a squat, which is a 2-leg knee, give or take your body position. Again, nuance, we can talk about that. Then I do dumbbell row, and that can be a horizontal pull. Well, I want to do a press, so then I can do bench press. And I've got leg stuff, I've got pull, and I've got push. And then what we would do is we would just alter one of those variables. So instead of, let's take dumbbell bench press, and I have 2 arms horizontally pushing, well, maybe I wanted to make it vertical, and now I do a shoulder press. So I have press, but I altered the variable of horizontal to vertical. And I can even send like a fun little how-to algorithm that I have for our coaches that you can add to your content and with the podcast to help it like visibly see where this goes. But it's 4 to 6 exercises. I know I have this menu item of boxes I need to check: legs, knees, hips, push, pull, horizontal, vertical. Did I get those things? Cool. You have a comprehensive program. And after you check off those boxes or those big rocks, you can go into the little rocks. So maybe it's calf raises. If you're a big mountain hiker and you have to approach 2 hours to get to somewhere, right? Your calves are going to be pretty sore. The one thing that the New River Gorge always kicks my ass on last weekend was the approaches going in. I forget how steep and windy everything is. It takes 30 minutes to go touch the rock for the first time. And I'm like, damn, mountain biking does not do the job for me. I need to stop riding my bike into my local crag. I have to stop walking again. But right, like general fitness, like it's a big component of actually going to the thing and climbing. But now we're talking to climbers, and climbers want fingers first. So very often as a coach, I like to do the fingers first because you kind of like reel in the climber a little bit. You're like, hey, here's fingers first. Okay, now give me some bench press. Hey, here's a little fingers. And, Right. So day one, you start off, you're just doing your finger work. So maybe it's the finger curls or the hangs or the pickups. We can dive into the actual exercise. But you do that, and now you have a finger rest of doing squat, push, pull. It's the off season, so maybe I have a little bit more time and energy, give or take the person, and I can do it like a second round of fingers, which I think one of the principles of the off season, it allows you more energy to lift, right? Rather than more energy to use your fingers on the wall. So it's usually like an optional second time.
All right, there's the dreaded fade out to wrap up your free intro to this pro clinic here on strength training, which continues for another hour, and it covers some really, really good stuff. I'm talking about specific and proven finger training protocols that only take about 20 minutes a week, grip positions to make your finger training more effective and bring faster adaptations, specific exercises for full body strength training that complement one another, rep and set ranges for each exercise, and an example schedule that'll work for most climbers, including exactly what to train on each day and how to build impressive strength in just a couple of hours a week. We get really nerdy, but also we get really specific. We get simple in the specificity so that you could leave this pro clinic with a training program that you can put to work starting this week, and it'll take you for a few months, from fingers to legs to upper body. It is all there, and they lay it out very, very clearly in this pro clinic. And hey, if you needed another reason to go ahead and sign up as a Patron or Apple subscriber beyond just getting the rest of this Pro Clinic and everything else that you get, you also will be entered to win a custom 12-week plan with Coach Collin McGee, including an hour consultation. So you can talk through how you move as a weightlifter, as a climber, what your limitations are, perhaps as a weightlifter, if you've got any injuries, the resources that you have access to, all of that will help him to build out a custom self-guided 12-week plan just for you. And you're automatically entered if you support the Struggle Climbing Show or C4HP as a patron. I recommend supporting both. So anyway, this contest is going to be open from today, the day of release of this episode, to July 3rd. So you've got a week to swing over, sign up and support one of our Patreon accounts there, and you will automatically be entered for this awesome giveaway. And if you don't win, or if you just want to go ahead and buy this program and get started right now, you can get a massive discount. You can use code STRUGGLE at checkout over at C4HP for that custom self-guided 12-week plan, and that's going to give you $50 off. So it's $125 instead of $175 using code STRUGGLE. The links are in your show notes. Get strong, and thank you again for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to hear the rest of this Pro Clinic, plus get instant access to more than 60 hours of other banger content, and I'm talking about Pro Clinics and bonus episodes from the likes of Adam Andra, Chris Sharma, Nina Williams, Dave McLeod, Hazel Finley, Tom Randall, Alex Honnold, and so many more. It's all over there. I think it's worth a few bucks a month, but if you don't like it, you can cancel anytime. No worries, no questions asked. If you're an iPhone person, you can subscribe right there in your Apple Podcast player, or just swing on over to patreon.com/The Struggle Climbing Show to support me there and get instant access to all those goods. Now be sure to check your show notes for links from this conversation and how to work with today's pro, and you can see clips from this conversation over on IG at The Struggle Climbing Show. The Struggle is carbon neutral in partnership with the Honnold Foundation and is a proud member of the Plugtone Audio Collective, a diverse group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. This show was produced and hosted by me, Ryan Devlin, and edited by Glenn Walker. All right, what are you waiting for? Pop over to Patreon and listen to the rest of this Banger Pro Clinic. I hope your training and your climbing are going great. And you know what? If you're struggling like me, well, let's just remember that the struggle makes us stronger. I'll see y'all.